This week, examining the tactics of resistance developed by two opposition newspapers during the 1980s. Why a well-known chocolate brand couldn't catch a break in a long-running trademark battle. A local expert says gender equality is a catalyst for innovation, particularly in the science and technology sectors, and how an American multinational retailer paid an action-packed ode to motherhood. Now, first up this week, the period of apartheid was a perilous time in South Africa's history, and a new book by Bryan Trabold, an associate professor at Suffolk University in the United States, entitled Rhetorics of Resistance, examines the tactics of resistance developed by those working for the Weekly Mail and New Nation. They were two opposition newspapers published in South Africa in the 1980s. The author was in South Africa this past week for the launch. So firstly, more than 2 decades into democracy, do we now have a better idea of the role that these two newspapers played? It really is an astonishing read, particularly for people of my vintage who were around as a young reporter in the early and the mid-80s. More than 2 decades, though, into democracy in this country, I wonder if we have a better idea of the role that these two newspapers, the Weekly Mail as it was then, Mail and Guardian now, and the New Nation actually played. Do we understand and value their importance?
I think so. I mean, I think with the passage of time and a little bit of historical perspective, we get a sense, particularly because we are now immersed in social media. And these were operating in a time of the late 1980s before the internet existed. So I think right now when people have this sense of what it means to read the media, they can click on all these websites and so forth. Back then, these were two newspapers, as you know, that came out once a week, every Friday, 28 pages, and that was your information until the next Friday. So I think they really developed a following and a readership that just doesn't exist in today's media.
How do you think they moved the needle at the time politically, given that they were often writing for a constituency of people who knew what was happening anyway?
You know, for the Weekly Mail, they were trying to reach a black audience and a white audience. And I understood what they were trying to do. They were trying to bring the violence that was happening in black communities to a white readership. And so I asked Swalaki Sisulu, I said, you know, you're targeting primarily a black readership. Black South Africans are very acutely aware of what's going on in their communities. You know, what is the purpose of New Nation? And both he and Amrit Manga explained to me, Swalaki had this great phrase. He said it served as a transporter of shared experience. And what he meant by that was that the struggles that were going on in local communities tended to be confined, and they knew about their struggles, but they weren't aware of what was happening in other parts of the country. So Amrit Manga gave the example, if you're fighting over water in this community and you're fighting over a living wage in this community, those are linked. Those are both struggles against apartheid. So I think what the New Nation particularly was trying to do was kind of link these spaces and link the various protests that were going on across the country.
At the time, how hazardous an undertaking was it for the people concerned?
Well, it was very hazardous for Swalaki Sisulu. I opened the book with a terrifying moment when mass members of the security forces come into his home, take him outside of Soweto, lead him to believe they're going to kill him, and then eventually take him and detain him for 2 years.
And he's resigned to the fact, isn't he, at that point? There's almost a strange sense of calmness that comes over him.
There is. I conducted these interviews in 1999, and I still can remember how he slowed at that point of the interview, trying to convey this feeling this was his final moment. So, you know, very dangerous for him. He's detained for 2 years. Erwin Minoyam, the co-founder and co-editor of the Weekly Mail, his house is firebombed. Anton Harbour, 2 security police are assigned to him, and they shoot shotgun blasts through his front door, string dead animals outside his door, throw rocks and bricks through his window, threatening phone calls at night. So there was a real overt attempt of intimidation on the part of the government towards these newspapers.
Bryan, without getting too academic,
yes.
I do want to ask you this question.
Yeah.
You raise the issue of the importance, the value of writing as a means of resistance in a climate of censorship. Yeah. How successful, then, do you think these newspapers were in that respect?
I think they were very successful in giving information to their readerships that just was not available in the mainstream. The mainstream, there were many courageous journalists operating in the mainstream, as I'm sure you know, but they were ultimately constrained within relatively conservative newspaper organizations that were a little wary of pushing the boundaries too much. So I think Weekly Mail and New Nation got a lot of information out to their readers who really wanted that information. And I think they also challenged the mainstream media to potentially be a little bit more aggressive.
And the horror of the situation is that the apartheid government at the time was passively aggressive as far as they were concerned, because it was publish, if you dare, be damned, and face the consequences.
Yes.
And that was scary, wasn't it?
Well, it was very scary because, no one really knew Norman Manoyam, who is the brother of Erwin Manoyam. He had this great phrase, he said, people who wrote these laws, people said they're stupid, they can't write a good law. And he said, actually, they're very smart. They didn't want you to know where the edge of the cliff was. And if you don't know where the edge of the cliff is, then you're very cautious and you don't get close to it. And so that's what a lot of mainstream newspapers did.
They simply self-censored.
Exactly. And that's the one thing that the Weekly Mail and New Nation was determined not to do. If it was unclear, what their approach would be is you venture forth into that gray area and then say, well, the regulation was unclear.
Let's talk about that gray area, because you also write about tactics and diversions.
Yes.
And they had a firm understanding at the time of how to exploit those legal loopholes, often very creatively.
Very creatively. The Weekly Mail in particular was very innovative with their legal tactics, and they had a very aggressive and very thoughtful attorney by the name of David Dyson. And so two of their strategies, and Erwin talked about this in his interviews, and he wrote a book himself. He described it as the all-clear flag, which is where you put a legal justification for an article that might be somewhat tenuous. You put it next to or within the article itself, because at a certain stage of the emergency, the police were coming out to review the paper beforehand. Well, your average policeman doesn't have an acute sense of the law and the legal niceties. They see this impressive legal justification. They're more than apt to let it go on the streets. Now, if it gets out on the streets, and then the Minister of Information, who does know more about the law, calls them on it, that all-clear flag is a way of the newspapers saying, look, we were trying to adhere to the law. This was our interpretation.
We tested it to the best of our ability.
Exactly, and we just are genuinely confused. Now, a lot of times they weren't as confused as they let on. They knew they were being very aggressive, but it was all part of the performance. They were pretending to adhere to the law while they were knowingly pushing the boundaries. In fact, pushing the boundaries often where I think they probably had a sense they were transgressing.
And sometimes very impish. So remind us of the front page in the Mail and Guardian with the telephone numbers.
So,
a classic front page if ever there was one.
So Anton, I came upon this in the archives, and I just was laughing out loud, and I asked Anton a little bit about it. Basically, they were poring over the regulations, and they said, if there's any questions about this, call the appropriate minister. So what they did is they featured on their front page, if you have any questions about the appropriate regulations, contact the following ministers. And they put all of the ministers, including the state president, P.W. Botha, and they put their name and they listed their phone numbers, their personal phone numbers, not their office phone numbers. So yes, there was a sense in the Weekly Mail of trying to laugh, I like the term you use, an impish attitude. Somewhat, this was largely the product of Erwin Manoyam. Sean Johnson, he described Erwin Manoyam as someone who has an elliptical brain, and there's this way of kind of,
it's a lovely description.
Yeah, it is.
What about the language of journalism that was deployed at the time? Do you refer to it, I think, as hidden codes within the way in which
Yes.
the writing was constructed?
Yes. So this is a concept, again, coined by Erwin Minoyem called oblique speak. And this was a tactic where you could imply and infer certain meanings without necessarily explicitly stating them. So one of the tactics they tended to use, they would use certain code words. You know, a white man in a uniform was seen fleeing the explosion. They would describe the dress of the police without identifying them as police.
And it was a subliminal pact with the audience, with the readership, wasn't it?
So the readership was fully aware of what was going on. They were writing for an audience because there were these shared assumptions between the writers and the audience. They were not writing for people who were willing to give the benefit of the doubt to the apartheid government, right? They were writing for readers who were acutely aware of the kinds of violence the apartheid government was carrying out. And so when they would use some of these code words, hooded men, right? You know, 3 hooded men were seen driving away from the explosion. Well, you know, when you're a Weekly Mail reader, you know who that is.
There's a fulcrumatic point, I think, with both of these newspapers when they become more confrontational when threatened with closure. It becomes a lot more, it goes beyond sort of passive into what? What was the change at that point? Do you remember?
Well, the change at that point is, at first they thought maybe we can play around with the law enough and maybe we can play around with language enough. And when it's clear that the government is going to shut them down, and that the courts are not going to protect them in any way.
Then it's gloves on.
Then it's gloves off, and now it's just a political fight.
I don't want to put you in an awkward position. The Vrije Weekblad.
Yeah.
Is there a reason why you didn't focus too extensively on that?
My limitations.
Yeah.
My limitations in that I don't speak Afrikaans.
I mean, you would acknowledge the role that Max de Pree and Jacques Poe played.
Absolutely. This question was asked at the launch as well. The reason I did not focus on Vrije Weekblad is even if I could have learned Afrikaans so I had a basic understanding of what they were doing.
It's a very nuanced, it's a nuanced subject, yeah.
Because I knew that these newspapers were manipulating language, I would have never learned it to the point where well, this is an illusion, or oh, they're playing with this phrase right here in Afrikaans. So I acknowledge that quite overtly in my introduction. This is strictly my limitations as a researcher. Had I known Afrikaans, I would have definitely studied it. I mean, an opposition newspaper written in Afrikaans with Max de Pree, with the revelations that they uncovered, absolutely.
Just a final question.
Yeah.
When you have, in your research, when you were talking to the various journalists and editors involved, what was their feeling about what they did? Were they looking back with a degree of nostalgia? Was it accomplishment, fear, regret, combination of all of it? What would it have been, I wonder?
I conducted these interviews a long time ago, 1998, 1999. My sense is that...
Boy, it's taken you a long time to write it, eh?
It sure has. Well, it was a dissertation, and then, so it's taken me a long time. At that time when I interviewed them, I think there was a sense of relief, right? I mean, as there was, I think that was palpable in the country at the time in 1998, 1999. Relief, just a sense of real genuine accomplishment. But I have to say this, also a sense of humility. I can't tell you how many journalists said, look, you shouldn't make us out to be more than we were, right? There were the unions, there was UDF, there was the End Conscription Campaign, there were the churches, there were all of these groups that were operating at that time. We were important in that we were kind of a communication network that was linking all of these groups, linking the different spaces within the country. But while there was a sense of, real satisfaction at what they did, I also sensed a real sense of humility. Like, don't make us out to be more than we are. But I think they were tremendously important newspapers.
Bryan, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Coming up on the program, why a well-known chocolate brand couldn't catch a break in a trademark battle which lasted 16 years.
South Africa's first choice for news. This is ENCA.